Joining us now is Al Root, Senior Special Writer at Barron's. Al, it's great to have you on here in person at the New York Stock Exchange. You often join us via Skype, so it's awesome to have you here in person. What is the different question that investors are starting to ask? Because if we look at Boeing's stock price, as you write in your story, it's still reflecting a when, not if scenario for the 737 MAX.
Right, and I think you have different groups of stakeholders, and it's almost like Boeing stock has become completely immune to any news, right? Southwest Airlines took it out of its schedule again for another month. That'll continue to happen. Over the last few days, Boeing stock is sort of drifting up about $5.
Isn't that the nature of a duopoly, though? And a duopoly in the sense of companies not really being able to say, hey, let's call. We're not going to go with Boeing. We're going to call up Airbus and order 20 planes. You can't do that for a lot of different reasons. One, it takes years to wait for an A320 or another Airbus jet. Two, these pilots are trained already on 737s and Boeing equipment, so they can't just switch providers.
Right, that's exactly right. It's not exactly like going into a car dealership. There's about 100 of these A320neos or 737s that roll off assembly lines a month. They're ordered out years in advance, 4 or 5 years in advance. So if you wanted to flip your order book or your strategy as an airline, good luck. You'd sort of be waiting for new deliveries in the 2025, 2026 timeframe. That's one of the reasons industry participants have a vested interest in making sure the plane flies again. And when we wrote what happens if the MAX never flies again, it's fair to point out that's a very unlikely scenario, and Boeing's been very consistent in saying, hey, listen, we have a path to get this thing off the ground and in the sky again. But all of these little data points that come up from day to day, I think in reflecting on the stock price, it's just not answering the bigger questions for investors.
So what are some of the bigger questions for investors, and how does Boeing address those?
That's a good question. It's an interesting question because Boeing has not been incredibly forthcoming about the overall situation on sort of a holistic manner. A report comes out or a quarterly earnings report, and they'll release a little bit of information. The bigger questions that need to be addressed or that people want is how is the plane going to be made safe again? And how did this happen? And what steps you're going to take to prevent it in the future. There's been sort of no town hall, for lack of a better term, come to Jesus moment about what we're going to do in the future, how we're going to restore our reputation. This is what's going to happen. Right now, it feels like a badly managed recall and death by 1,000 cuts.
Yeah. And do we have any sense on the pulse of consumers, whether or not they would actually feel comfortable flying in one of these jets?
That's a good question. So UBS has done a couple of surveys where they've asked 1,000 flyers, what are your plans? How do you feel about the 737 MAX? Their math was only about 3 to 5% of flyers will refuse to get on the plane ever again. Their research indicates that it's about a 6-month, waiting period of, safe operation. I think you should point out that the operators like Southwest Airlines say, we have 10,000 flights of perfect operation and our pilots are well trained. So there is a battle. I think there's one other point to be made that when IAG ordered the 737 MAX, the first big order.
That's the parent company of British Airways.
That's British Airways, exactly.
I
Ordered 200 MAX jets. It was a letter of intent. It was the big splash at the Paris Air Show. In that press release, they called it the 737-800. They did not refer to it as the MAX. It's almost like taking President Trump's idea to rebrand it. So, when you go and search on the website, oh, what am I flying? Oh, I'm flying a Dash 800. Fantastic. At least I'm not flying on a MAX.
Wow.
That's really interesting. I'm wondering about leadership at Boeing and what questions investors are not only going to be asking, but what demands they're going to have about executive leadership at Boeing, given that executives CEO has been at the company for a long time, and he also oversees the board too. Will there be calls for him when this is done to step aside because he oversaw all this?
It's a good question. I certainly wouldn't want to say that Mr. Muhlenberg should, step aside or lose his job. I don't think that's for me to say. I think that it's fair to say that the recall and the grounding has been managed poorly, and the communication has been managed poorly. I think, in fairness to Boeing, it's partly because it's engineering and it's business-to-business transactions, and they're working on these things every day, and they never sort of envision the full backlash. But that is on them. Maybe it could increase pressure to separate the chairman role from the CEO role. Mr. Muhlenberg has been sort of trying to be more active, but as time has gone on, he went on CBS News, he recorded a video sort of apologizing to the families of affected by the 2 deadly crashes. But again, it feels like they're a little behind the curve addressing concerns of the flying public.
If 346 people died on this jet in America, do you think the reaction would be different?
I think, for me, I think 100% different. I do think in some of the regulatory hearings, actually, I watched it. I watched the FAA hearing where the lawmakers started grilling the FAA. How did you ever approve this? And I can't say anything was politically motivated, but you do get questions over, well, how were these pilots trained? What are the protocols in these countries? There was a question about record keeping for pilot training at some of these airlines. Is that fair? It's not really fair, and the crash investigations will become public, but over many months from now. But I do think that it would be a wholly different matter. I think that people still believe, and it's true. The FAA and American flight travel has a tremendous safety record, tremendous record of innovation, taking care of people, taking people from point A to point B safely. So I do think it would be very different if it was an American accident.
Al Root, Senior Special Writer at Barron's, thank you so much for joining us today on Cheddar Business.
Good to be here.